Hello, comrades. Thank you to the comrades of Speak Out Socialist for inviting me to this meeting. Why did the death of one person lead to nearly 3 months of massive nationwide protests in Iran? And why did peaceful protests for basic rights provoke such massive repression and carnage on the streets? The short answer is that Iran was a powder keg ready for a spark. For decades, many inequalities have been building up in Iranian society. Grievances about social inequalities go back to the 1960s and 70s. These led to the 1979 revolution and were never resolved. They never went away. The way that they were dealt with was through brutal repression and war. And under this regime, we've also had corruption, massive corruption, tyranny, which have reached unprecedented levels. More recently, we've had the economic sanctions and the very callous way that the regimes dealt with the COVID pandemic, which has killed many people and created economic hardship for many people, and the discontent of workers and all exploited and oppressed layers in Iranian society has reached very high levels. If we look at some of the figures, I mean, we have to bear in mind that official figures in Iran are even disputed between different parts of the state apparatus. You know, like the central bank says inflation is one thing, and then the census, the statistics bureau says it's something else. But anyway, inflation is 42%, over 42%, and food inflation is over 60%. There is unemployment at about 9.4%, and youth unemployment is 23%. And in Kurdish and Baluch areas, it's even more. And poverty, this is according to the World Bank, is something like 27.6%. So this is a society that, despite all the oil and gas wealth and many other minerals, is not able to meet the very basic needs of the population, of not only the working class, but a huge section of society. So who's been protesting? Mahsa, Amini, and her Kurdish name is Jina, and a lot of people call this the Jina revolution, but that's a different thing we can go into later. Anyway, Mahsa or Jina Amini was a Kurdish woman of 22 years, and her death has brought huge sections of women and girls into the streets for the first time. Students and young people have been obviously very active because Iran's population is very young. About 22% are 10 to 24 years old, and 60% of university students are women. And of course, being Kurdish, the Kurdish areas have been very active in protesting against what happened. So the initial spark, combining the fact that this was a woman, she was young and Kurdish, has sparked wide participation by young people, women, especially women, and even schoolgirls, and of course Kurdish people. And as I said, there is such wide discontent with this regime and its lack of ability to provide the basics of both economically and social rights and so on, that many others, including other national minorities like the Baluchis, have joined in. Workers obviously have been involved, but they've been mostly involved as individuals, not as organized groups. And more recently, we've seen truck drivers and truck owners who, and obviously the truck owners are not workers, but such is the level of discontent and the regime's not caring and not wanting to solve some very basic issues for people who have small businesses. There has been protests by them. We've had the shops and businesses shutting down in many areas as protests against the regimes dealing with them. So How have the protests been organized? We've seen that the street demonstrations have had some level of organization, very limited, mostly local coordination, but there hasn't really been overall leadership. This protest has obviously benefited from the protests that we've had previously, learned the lessons of the previous protests. We've had, especially the one in November 2019, when we had fuel price rises, and that led to massive protests when the prices of gasoline went up by about 200%. With the big protests there caused the regime to deal with it very, very harshly, killing something like 1,500 people. But the lessons from that experience include things like people break the CCTV cameras, they cover themselves up, their faces, so they're not recognized, and they've learned tactics in terms of pushing back the state's, basically the state's thugs. And of course, with students, they've always been for many years active in university campuses, have their own rallies with very radical slogans. And in many cases, they've also, in the past few weeks, done away with the regime's gender segregation. So they have their meals together, the girls and the boys together, and so on. Of course, in the Kurdish areas, we've had the traditional Kurdish organization. They've had some involvement, and of course, the Kurdish youth have been very active, and they've joined protests in the Kurdish areas. And obviously, they have a long tradition of resisting oppression from Tehran, from the center of the state apparatus in Iran. And we've had also, obviously, teachers going on strike again, and they've, over the past few years, they've been on strike many times, and they've been coordinating their activities, their strikes, and many of these groups have been using social media to coordinate their strikes and protests. So what's been the difference between this time and the previous protests? We have to obviously say that the economic situation now is much worse than a few years ago, and we've seen in many countries, even in so-called advanced countries, we've seen, because of the aftermath of the pandemic, supply issues, recently the prices of energy and so on. There have been many countries that have had problems with not just working class people, even middle class people having problems with the cost of living. So the economic situation in Iran is much worse than before. Secondly, we've seen a huge buildup of grievances, as I mentioned earlier. Thirdly, we've had the experience of previous mass protests, and of course, the important thing has been here has been worker strikes, which I'll deal with a bit later. And of course, women, youth, and Kurds have joined in large numbers. The role of women, especially, has been very important this time. It's been the key, especially young women, including schoolgirls. And we've seen that young men have also joined them to support them. The high level of involvement by women, I think, is, and their active role, it's not just numbers who've been, the role they've played is, I think, a very important feature of the next revolution will take place in Iran, hopefully in the near future. In terms of what the working class has been, been doing, we've seen that workers groups have issued statements declaring their support for the women, for young people in the streets, for the national minorities, and many other people who've been protesting. The teachers have obviously taken solidarity strikes, taken solidarity action, and many industries have been on strike, including, steel, various parts of the oil industry, particularly the contract workers, and so on. So, but these have not been linked with the protests or with other strikes, except perhaps in Khuzestan in the southwest, where you have most of the oil, gas, and petrochemical facilities, and they have had some coordination in Khuzestan. So despite being at the forefront of struggles in the past 4 or 5 years, the working class has not played the role it should have, and the experiences of the past 4 and 5 years, especially, for example, the Haftape sugarcane complex, where workers have been talking about workers' control and having workers' councils running the factory, and also looking at further issues in society. They haven't been able to taking leading part in strikes and linking them, and they've mainly stayed in terms of particular companies or industries. So these gains of the past few years through very radical struggles in the past few years haven't been able to link to the new developments in the general movements that have been started by women, young people, and national minorities. And most importantly, we haven't had the permanent staff of the national oil company going on strike. We've had, as I said, the contract workers going on strike, but not the crucial part, which is the permanent staff of the national oil company. One of the weaknesses that has obviously contributed to this is that the workers' movement, and this is an important weakness that unfortunately has come, has been highlighted with the latest few months, the events of the latest few months, is that the attempt to try to set up European-style trade unions has come to a dead end. This wasn't a strategy that was going to work in Iran. And all the workers all the labor activists and workers who were involved in this have become, who were doing these activities publicly or openly, like the Vahed bus drivers. They've all been compromised. They've all been identified by the regime. Either they're in jail or they're followed, and there's heavy surveillance, so they can't really do anything. And this has once again shown that we need to have underground cells and networks for the working class to be even able to do consistent work in terms of fighting for basic things like jobs and pay and conditions. As for the regime, we've seen that the regimes might have wobbled to begin with, but it's not collapsed or anything. I don't think is threatened at present. It's not being threatened by imperialism. No one's going to be overthrowing it, changing it, and the right-wing opposition, nor the left-wing opposition is in any position to really put it under significant pressure. What we've had is that although a lot of money has been spent on various satellite TV and radio stations, these are merely used as putting pressure on the regime, and they're not in a position to do anything to overthrow it or to significantly undermine it. And a few days ago, the regime was able to carry out the first execution. And it's important to point out that this person wasn't executed by the state because he'd killed somebody. It merely injured a Basiji. A Basiji is like a mobilization young thug that the regime uses to oppress students, women, anybody who even raises questions about some basic rights in Iran. So this person, all he did was to injure a Basiji person with a knife, and he was executed for declaring war against God, as it were. So the regime has been in a position to arrest at least 16,000 people, and again, these figures aren't accurate because the regime has admitted about 200 people that it's killed, but at least 500 people, according to many international human rights organizations. There are at least 50 children that is killed, and it's on top of aiming to kill people, it's also using pellets to aim at people's eyes as punishment, and especially with women genitals. It's using ambulances to hide the people who are shooting at people. So you'll see an ambulance and not think that it's any threat to you, but then it's suddenly shooting at you. It's used, for example, ice cream vans to move troops around. Again, you don't think of an ice cream van as being a threat, but then suddenly, the doors open and a lot of armed thugs come out of it. In the prisons, they're using torture and rape, and this is something, basically it's part of the playbook, as it were, the routine of the regime. It does this all the time. They abduct people, they make them disappear. So you hear about some teacher who hasn't been seen by anybody for days. His family don't know where he is. Same with school students. Some teenager suddenly disappears. And while obviously in prison, they force confessions out of you. And of course, if they can say that you've waged war against God, then obviously execution is what could be facing you the minute they decide to go ahead with it. At the same time, the regimes also attacked Kurdish groups. These are Kurdish groups from Iran that are basically have bases or headquarters in Iraq. Missile strikes have been aimed at them, and also at the same time, there's been some kind of coordination with Turkey that's attacked Kurds in Syria. And of course, the normal business of surveying people and controlling their phone and raiding your home and taking your computer away, your phone away, and all these things, and asking, bringing you for question. All of these things still go on. So, what do we think are the big challenges ahead? The big question that is posed. We think that the main thing that the working class has been lacking, and that's why, even though the working class during the past 4 or 5 years at least has been very radical, has been posing very radical demands like workers' control, workers' councils, and the mass movement lately, particularly women, have been very brave. Young people have been fighting against the armed thugs of the regime with nothing, just a few things to throw back at them. All of these have not been able to shift the balance of power significantly, have not weakened the regime significantly. And we think that the outcome of all this, the uprising and all the different movements that have been involved, and unfortunately they are quite separate still, is that unless the working class intervenes as an organized class, as not as individuals who turn up in some protests, but as a class, to show its class strength, its role in the economy, and particularly the oil, gas, and petrochemical workers that are the lifeline of this regime, then there will not be any victory. It's only when the working class intervenes as a class that they can win not only their own victory, but also pose a revolutionary leadership for all other exploited classes and oppressed layers in society, because there can only be 2 types of leadership in capitalist society. Either it's one provided by the workers or one provided by the capitalists. So in the immediate few weeks, and this has been posed right from the beginning, is what we need is a general strike where the workers of the major industries come together and they support the protests of women, youth, and national minorities, and take concrete steps in terms of dealing with all the socio-economic problems that led to the 1979 revolution. These, as I said earlier, these are problems that caused the revolution, but were never solved because the revolution was defeated by this regime. So all those problems have stayed there. They've become much more entrenched, much worse. And we've also had many new problems caused by the way uh, the structure of the capitalist system in Iran, but also by the corruption and the mismanagement of this regime. So I'd like to end with this, that in order to achieve the most basic economic and social and democratic rights in Iran, it is the working class that needs to seize power, to seize state power, not only for itself, to solve its own problems, but also to solve all the other problems that women, young people, national minorities, LGBT plus people, uh, anybody who has the slightest needs for having we might call a normal life, and these people are roughly about 90% of the population in Iran, then unless the working class seizes power, these problems that all these people have cannot be solved. So the working class, once again, is the key to the outcome of this whole movement, and it needs to have its own command center, a specific kind of a party that organizes underground, secretly, and poses the questions of linking up all workers' struggles and providing a leadership for all the other struggles. So, and hopefully maybe in the discussion we can go into more detail about this, but I think for now I'll just end and say thank you very much to the comrades of Speak Out Socialists for inviting me, and